The burlap sack bobbed to the surface like a prayer answered by devils, torn fabric trailing crimson threads through brackish swamp water. Inside what remained of the crude prison, something had clawed its way to freedom, leaving behind evidence of a struggle that defied every law of nature and justice that 1809 Florida Territory understood. This is the story of how one enslaved man turned ancient Roman punishment into modern American nightmare, using nothing more than needle, thread, and the kind of rage that ferments in bondage until it becomes something else entirely. Before we descend into this chapter of violence, buried in courthouse records and whispered through generations, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been suppressed for over 2 centuries. The Fairfield plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Florida palmetto scrub, where Spanish moss draped from cypress trees like funeral shrouds and alligators sunned themselves on logs that looked too much like floating corpses. Master Edmund Fairfield ruled his domain with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never questioned his right to own other human beings, his overseer's whip cracking across backs bent under the subtropical sun that turned cotton fields into furnaces by noon. 28-year-old Tobias had been purchased at auction in Charleston 3 years earlier, separated from his wife and infant son, who were sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He'd never seen them again. In the Fairfield quarters, he became known for 2 things: an encyclopedic knowledge of knots learned during his youth on fishing boats, and a silence so complete that other enslaved people wondered if grief had stolen his voice along with his family. "Pass the cornbread, would you, Edmund?" Mrs. Catherine Fairfield asked her husband across their mahogany dining table, not noticing how Tobias tracked every movement from his position by the door, serving the evening meal with hands that remembered tying nets strong enough to haul in sharks. The inspiration had come from an overseer's drunken boasting about Roman history, how emperors used to execute patricides by sewing them into leather sacks with wild animals and throwing them into the Tiber River. Edmund Fairfield had laughed at the story, declaring it too good for rebellious slaves, not realizing that Tobias stood close enough to memorize every detail of the ancient punishment called poena culi. What the Romans understood, and what Tobias would perfect, was that some deaths needed to be witnessed by the elements themselves. That sultry August night, as crickets sang their metallic chorus and night-blooming jasmine sweetened air thick enough to swim through, Tobias waited in the tool shed until the plantation fell into the deep sleep that comes before dawn. The burlap sack lay spread across the workbench like a shroud awaiting its purpose, heavy cotton thread and sailmaker's needle arranged beside it with surgical precision. But the sack would need occupants beyond its intended victim, creatures that understood the language of confined spaces and territorial rage. From the Territorial Archives of Florida, August 15, 1809. Estate inventory lists unusual livestock losses: 6 rattlesnakes missing from collection, 1 hunting dog unaccounted for. Tobias had spent weeks observing, learning the rhythms of predator and prey that governed swampland survival. He knew which snakes struck fastest when cornered, which breeds carried venom that paralyzed before it killed, and most importantly, how to handle them with the respect of someone who understood that death came in many forms, not all of them quick. The dog posed a different challenge. Rex was Fairfield's prize hunting hound, trained to track runaway slaves through miles of trackless swamp, his nose capable of following 3-day-old scent trails through water and mud. But dogs, like men, had weaknesses that patient observation could exploit. A piece of meat, laced with just enough laudanum to induce sleep, not death, dropped where Rex would find it during his evening patrol. Justice has its own mathematics. The master bedroom window remained open to catch any breeze that might stir the oppressive summer air. Gauze curtains hanging motionless as prayer flags in the humid stillness. Edmund Fairfield slept the deep sleep of a man whose conscience bore no weight, his wife beside him dreaming of whatever occupied the minds of those who bought and sold human souls like commodities on a market ledger. What happened next would depend entirely on whether 18 years of bondage had taught Tobias patience enough to wait for the perfect moment, or whether rage would consume precision and turn calculated revenge into meaningless violence. The difference between justice and murder, often measured in heartbeats and held breath. But how do you sew a living man into a sack without waking the entire household? The floorboards beneath Edmund Fairfield's bed creaked once, soft as a whisper, then fell silent. Tobias stood motionless in the doorway, sailmaker's needle glinting between his fingers like a sliver of moonlight, while the master's breathing continued its steady rhythm of untroubled sleep. The art of subduing a man without sound required knowledge that plantation life had beaten into every enslaved person's bones. How to move through a house like smoke, how to read the language of floorboard and hinge, how to make yourself invisible, even when standing in plain sight. Tobias approached the bed with the patience of someone who understood that rushed vengeance was failed vengeance. The laudanum-soaked cloth covered Fairfield's mouth and nose before consciousness could organize itself into resistance. 3 breaths, maybe 4, and the master's body relaxed into chemical sleep that would last exactly long enough for needle and thread to do their quiet work. But sedating a man was only the beginning of a process that required surgical precision and psychological steel. The burlap sack waited on the floor beside the bed, already prepared with its cargo of living fury. 6 diamondback rattlesnakes coiled in the darkness of the bag's interior, their heat-sensing pits detecting the warm-blooded presence that would soon join them in that confined space. Rex the hunting dog lay unconscious beside them, his drugged breath stirring the heavy fabric as his body generated the scent of fear that snakes interpreted as invitation to strike. From plantation records dated August 16, 1809, master's chamber found empty at dawn, bedclothes undisturbed. Window remains open, no sign of struggle or disturbance. Tobias lifted Fairfield's limp form with the efficiency of someone accustomed to moving dead weight, cotton bales, feed sacks, the occasional corpse when yellow fever swept through the quarters and bodies needed quick burial. The master weighed perhaps 160 pounds, soft from years of others' labor, muscles gone slack from a life spent giving orders rather than following them. The sewing began at the feet, heavy thread pulled tight through burlap weave-in stitches that would hold against any amount of thrashing. Tobias worked by touch in the darkness, his fingers reading the fabric like scripture, creating seams that would contain whatever violence erupted, once consciousness returned to the bag's occupants. Each stitch pulled snug, with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 years watching this man sell human beings like livestock, calculating the mathematical relationship between cruelty and consequence. Every few inches, needle met finger. Blood spotted the rough fabric, mixing Tobias's DNA with the sack that would become Fairfield's tomb. These crimson drops would survive long after the swamp had claimed its prize, evidence of hands that chose justice over mercy in the humid darkness of a Florida night. The snakes stirred as Fairfield's unconscious body joined them in their burlap prison. Rattles whispered against fabric like dice shaken in a cup, while Rex's drugged breathing created currents of air that carried human scent through the confined space. Territorial instincts older than civilization began asserting themselves in the darkness, preparing for violence that would erupt once the laudanum wore off. What separated this execution from simple murder was the ritual precision of its construction, the way ancient Roman law had been adapted to address modern American sin. By 3:30 in the morning, the sack was sealed, except for a small opening near what would be Fairfield's head, allowing air to circulate while ensuring that awakening would bring immediate awareness of shared imprisonment with creatures whose only language was strike and retreat. Tobias hefted the bundle, testing its weight against his shoulder, calculating the distance to the swamp, and the amount of time he had before dawn brought discovery and pursuit. The house remained locked in sleep as he carried his burden through hallways lined with portraits of Fairfield ancestors, past the dining room where silver gleamed on sideboards purchased with the sale of human flesh, across the veranda where Spanish moss filtered moonlight into patterns that looked like prison bars. But the hardest part of any execution isn't the killing. It's the walking away afterward, carrying the weight of what you've chosen to become. Behind him, Catherine Fairfield slept on, unaware that her husband had already begun his final journey into the primordial darkness of Okefenokee waters, where alligators and water moccasins govern territories older than any human law. By morning, she would become a widow, though the manner of her husband's death would remain hidden beneath black water for days to come. The swamp waited, patient as justice, ready to receive its offering and render final judgment on a system that turned human beings into property and expected gratitude for the privilege of bondage. But would the sack sink? Or would mourning fishermen discover evidence floating where everyone could see what happened when the powerless finally found their power? The cypress roots twisted beneath black water like arthritic fingers, reaching up from depths that had swallowed countless secrets over centuries of Spanish rule, Creek warfare, and now American expansion. Tobias waded into the Okefenokee, carrying his burden, feeling mud suck at his bare feet, while night sounds pressed against his ears. The bass note of bull alligators, the soprano splash of diving turtles, the percussion of insects that turned darkness into symphony. This swamp had devoured runaway slaves, lost explorers, and Creek warriors with equal indifference, its acidic waters preserving some secrets while dissolving others according to chemistry that predated human law. The sack across his shoulder had begun to stir. Inside the burlap prison, Edmund Fairfield's consciousness swam toward wakefulness, while 6 rattlesnakes tested their confined territory with flicking tongues and coiled tension. Rex remained unconscious, his drugged breathing creating the only peaceful sound in a space designed for violence. When full awareness returned to all occupants simultaneously, the mathematics of survival would reduce to reflexes older than civilization. Tobias chose his spot with the deliberation of someone who understood that some executions required witnesses, even if those witnesses were cypress trees and water moccasins. A clearing where moonlight penetrated the canopy, where morning fishermen might eventually discover what floated to the surface, where evidence could tell its story to anyone brave enough to interpret the signs. The water reached his chest as he prepared to release his burden into depths that had claimed Creek burial grounds and Spanish treasure ships with equal appetite. But before letting go, he spoke the only words he'd uttered since learning of his family's sale 3 years earlier. For my wife, Sarah. For my son, Moses. For every mother separated from her children. His voice carried across still water, like a prayer delivered to congregations of frogs and nightbirds. The sack hit the surface with a splash that sent ripples across water black as spilled ink. For a moment, it floated, burlap darkening as swamp water seeped through the weave, then began its descent toward a bottom littered with the bones of those who'd challenged this wilderness and lost. Inside the bag, awakening brought immediate panic as Fairfield's drug-clouded mind struggled to comprehend imprisonment, darkness, and the dry whisper of scales against fabric. From the personal journal of Dr. Marcus Webb, Territorial physician, August 17, 1809, called to Fairfield Plantation, master missing since dawn. Enslaved population claims ignorance. Unusual calm among the quarters suggests coordinated deception, but swamps keep their own schedules. What sinks doesn't always stay buried, and what dies doesn't always stay quiet. The Okefenokee operated on tidal rhythms that pulled secrets from the depths according to moon phases and storm pressure, returning evidence when morning fishermen least expected to become witnesses to justice delivered in burlap and thread. Tobias waded back toward shore, leaving no footprints on ground too soft to hold impressions. His clothing dripping with swamp water that would dry odorless by dawn. Behind him, the sack disappeared beneath the surface, while its contents began the final struggle between predator and prey, venom and rage, in a space too small for mercy or escape. The walk back to the quarters took 47 minutes through palmetto scrub and pine forest, past the cemetery where enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves, around the cotton gin where children learned to work before they learned to read. Dawn would bring questions he was prepared to answer with the same silence that had protected him through 3 years of bondage and grief. But silence, like burlap, had its limits. In the big house, Catherine Fairfield would wake to find her husband's side of the bed cold, his clothes hanging undisturbed in the wardrobe, his breakfast growing cold on china plates that had never touched enslaved lips. The search would begin with the stables, extend to the fields, and eventually reach the swamp, where morning mist rose like spirits escaping purgatory. What they would find floating 3 days later would challenge every assumption about power, revenge, and the price of treating human beings like livestock. The torn sack would surface empty, except for bloodstains and the lingering scent of fear that even swamp water couldn't wash away. Dawn broke across Fairfield Plantation like a held breath finally released. Spanish moss dripping with dew that caught early sunlight and scattered it into diamonds across ground still soft from the previous night's humidity. The bell that normally summoned enslaved workers to morning labor remained silent, while in the big house, Catherine Fairfield's screams echoed through rooms that had never heard a white woman's genuine terror. The 43 enslaved people working Fairfield's cotton fields faced a choice that would determine whether Tobias's act of revenge became legend or led them all to the gallows. In the quarters, conversations took place in glances and careful silences. Ruth, the head house servant who'd watched Tobias grow increasingly withdrawn after his family's sale, understood exactly what his disappearance the previous night meant. Samuel, the blacksmith, whose own wife had been sold to pay Fairfield's gambling debts, felt something that might have been satisfaction if such emotions were safe to acknowledge. Even the children seemed to sense that morning had brought a shift in the plantation's balance of power, though they couldn't name what had changed. "Master Edmund's missing," Catherine Fairfield announced to the assembled household staff, her voice cracking with panic barely held in check. "Search every building, every field. Question everyone. Someone knows something." But knowledge, like power, could be shared or withheld depending on whose interests it served. Tobias returned from his dawn trip to the tool shed, mud still drying on his work clothes, carrying a hoe that needed sharpening. To anyone watching, he appeared to be beginning another day of forced labor, his face displaying the same carefully neutral expression that had protected him through 3 years of bondage. Only the slight tremor in his hands betrayed the magnitude of what he'd accomplished in the swamp's darkness. From the Adams County Sheriff's records, August 17, 1809, interviewed 43 Negro slaves. All claim ignorance of master's whereabouts. Unusual unity in their responses suggests coordinated deception. Sheriff William Morrison arrived by horseback at 10:15 that morning, accompanied by his deputy and 2 slave catchers, whose professional experience included tracking runaways through terrain that swallowed most pursuers. They found a plantation operating in perfect order, except for the absence of its master. Cotton picked on schedule, livestock fed and watered, tools properly maintained. The enslaved community continued their work with the mechanical efficiency of people who understood that survival required invisibility. The search began in the master bedroom, where Morrison noted the open window and undisturbed bedclothes. No signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence beyond the simple fact of disappearance. Fairfield's clothes hung in the wardrobe. His money remained in the desk drawer. His favorite horse stood unsaddled in the stable. Everything suggested a man who'd simply vanished into the humid Florida night, like smoke dissipating in still air. "Question them separately," Morrison ordered his men. look for cracks in their story. But the enslaved community had spent generations perfecting the art of coordinated silence, turning ignorance into armor and unity into weapon. Ruth, when questioned, explained that she'd served the evening meal at 7 o'clock, cleared the table at 8:30, and retired to the quarters where she'd remained until dawn. Her story was corroborated by 6 other house servants who claimed to have spent the evening mending clothes and sharing gossip in the communal area between their cabins. Samuel the blacksmith had worked late, repairing a broken plow. Witnesses confirmed the sound of his hammer echoing across the quarters until well past midnight. Every alibi interlocked like carefully fitted stones in a wall designed to withstand official pressure. Tobias, when his turn came, met Morrison's questions with the same silence that had defined him since his family's sale. Yes, he'd been in the quarters all night. No, he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Master Fairfield was a good man who treated his people fairly. The lies came as easily as breathing, delivered with the flat affect of someone whose spirit had been systematically broken by years of bondage. Morrison studied Tobias's face, looking for the telltale signs of deception that experience had taught him to recognize. But 3 years of grief had carved away everything except essential functions: work, eat, sleep, survive. The sheriff saw exactly what Tobias intended him to see: another broken slave whose capacity for rebellion had been crushed beneath the weight of loss and powerlessness. Power has its own blindness. By afternoon, the search had expanded to neighboring plantations and the nearby town of Fernandina, where Fairfield sometimes conducted business or sought entertainment that Catherine preferred not to acknowledge. But swamps don't reveal their secrets on demand, and the Okefenokee kept its new treasure buried beneath black water while alligators sunned themselves on logs like innocent bystanders to justice. What would surface 3 days later would transform a missing person case into something that challenged every assumption about the relationship between master and slave, predator and prey. In a territory where Spanish law had given way to American expansion, but justice remained as wild and untamed as the swamps themselves. The torn sack would tell a story that official records could never capture, written in blood and burlap, and the kind of rage that ferments in bondage until it becomes something powerful enough to drag a master into the darkness where all men are equal. The fishing boat cut through morning mist that rose from black water like prayers ascending to indifferent heaven, its occupants casting nets into depths that had claimed Creek warriors and Spanish conquistadors with equal appetite. Brothers Samuel and Isaac Washington had worked these waters for 30 years, reading the swamp's moods through ripples and bird calls, understanding which channels led to fish and which led to the kind of discoveries that haunted men's dreams. Their nets pulled up more than bass and catfish that August morning. They brought evidence that would transform a missing person case into a reckoning with the mathematics of revenge. The torn burlap sack broke the surface trailing crimson threads through water that reflected sky like a broken mirror. Isaac recognized the fabric immediately: plantation weave, rough and serviceable, stitched with a heavy thread used for grain storage and cotton baling. But this sack had been sewn shut with surgical precision, its seams designed to contain rather than store, and something had clawed its way out from the inside with desperate violence. "Pull it aboard," Samuel whispered, though his hands trembled as they hauled the shredded evidence into their boat. "Whatever happened here, someone needs to see it." The blood had turned brown in the acidic water, but quantity told its own story. Too much for a simple drowning, not enough for a feeding frenzy. Something had died violently in that burlap prison, but death had come from venom rather than teeth, from calculated execution rather than random predation. Puncture wounds in the fabric suggested fangs, while claw marks spoke of desperate struggle in confined darkness. From the Washington brothers' testimony to Sheriff Morrison, found the sack floating near Devil's Elbow, where the current runs deepest. Never seen anything sewn so tight, like someone meant to keep something in rather than let it out. News of the discovery reached Fairfield Plantation by noon, carried by riders whose horses lathered with urgency across roads that connected swamp to civilization, like capillaries feeding a diseased heart. Catherine Fairfield collapsed when Sheriff Morrison described the blood-soaked evidence, understanding without words what her husband's disappearance had really meant. The missing master hadn't wandered off or run away. He'd been executed with a precision that spoke of long planning and bottomless rage. Morrison assembled his men in the plantation's main yard, where 43 enslaved people stood in perfect formation, their faces displaying the careful neutrality that had protected them through generations of white violence. Someone among them had sewn Edmund Fairfield into that sack with live snakes, had carried him to the swamp, and watched him drown in his own terror. The question wasn't whether murder had occurred, but which of these seemingly powerless people possessed the knowledge and courage to transform bondage into weapon. "Strip and search every cabin," Morrison ordered. "Look for needles, thread, anything that could have been used to sew that sack. Question them until someone breaks." But the search revealed only the expected poverty of slave quarters. One husk, corn husk mattresses, mended clothes, a few hidden coins. What they didn't find was more telling than what they discovered. No needles large enough for sail making, no heavy thread suitable for burlap work, no sign of the careful preparation that such an execution would have required. The enslaved community had spent 3 days erasing evidence with the same thoroughness they applied to cotton picking and field work. Tobias submitted to questioning with the mechanical compliance of someone whose spirit had been systematically broken. Yes, he could sew. Most enslaved people could mend their own clothes. No, he'd never worked with heavy thread or sailmaker's needles. Master Fairfield had been a fair man who deserved better than whatever violence had claimed him. The lies flowed like water over stone, smooth and unremarkable, while his hands remained steady despite the tremor that had marked him since his family's sale. Power creates its own blindness. Morrison studied each face, looking for the crack that would reveal guilt, but found only the practiced invisibility of people who'd learned to survive by reflecting back whatever white folks wanted to see. The sheriff understood slave psychology, knew that fear usually produced confession under sufficient pressure, but this community displayed something different, not fear, but resignation, as if they'd already calculated the cost of discovery and found it acceptable. That evening, as search parties dragged the swamp for Edmund Fairfield's body, something else surfaced in the shallows near where the sack had been found. Rex, the hunting dog, paddled weakly toward shore, his eyes clouded with the aftermath of drugged sleep, his coat slick with swamp water, but otherwise unharmed. Somehow, the animal had escaped the burlap prison, had clawed or bitten his way to freedom, while his master died beside him in snake-filled darkness. The dog's survival suggested calculation rather than random violence. Mercy extended to an innocent creature, while justice claimed its intended target. But Rex couldn't speak, couldn't identify his master's killer, could only whimper and shake as handlers led him back to kennels, where he would refuse food for days, traumatized by memories his animal brain couldn't process. The one witness to Edmund Fairfield's final moments would carry those secrets in silence, deeper than any human conspiracy. What other evidence might surface when storm tides stirred the swamp's buried secrets? Storm clouds gathered over the Okefenokee like bruises forming on beaten flesh, their bellies swollen with rain that would churn black water into chaos and force buried secrets to the surface. Lightning split the sky at 4:17 that afternoon, illuminating cypress trees that stood like gallows against the darkening horizon, while thunder rolled across water that had kept Edmund Fairfield's corpse for 6 days. The swamp was preparing to give up its prize, whether Sheriff Morrison was ready for that revelation or not. The search parties had dragged nets through every accessible channel, following currents that led deeper into territory, where Spanish moss hung thick as burial shrouds. and alligators claimed hunting grounds older than any human settlement. But the Okefenokee operated according to tidal rhythms that pulled objects from the depths when storm pressure demanded release, returning evidence according to natural law rather than human schedule. Tobias worked the cotton fields under clouds that promised deluge, his hoe striking earth with mechanical precision, while his mind calculated distances and currents, wondering if Edmund Fairfield's body would surface intact enough to tell its story, or dissolved enough to hide the truth beneath layers of swamp chemistry. The snakes had done their work in burlap darkness, but water and time had their own methods of erasure, turning flesh into something unrecognizable, except to those who understood the language of decomposition. From the Diary of Catherine Fairfield, August 23, 1809. Storm coming. Edmund still missing. The slaves watch me with eyes that know something I don't. God help us all, if he's truly gone. The first drops hit like accusations, fat and warm stirring dust that had baked under Florida sun until it cracked like broken promises. Within minutes, the deluge transformed plantation roads into rivers of red clay, while Spanish moss dripped with water that looked like tears shed for sins too numerous to catalog. In the big house, Catherine Fairfield stood at windows, watching lightning illuminate fields where her husband's property continued working despite his absence, their efficiency suggesting that masters were more replaceable than the system wanted to acknowledge. Morrison's search teams took shelter in abandoned fishing shacks scattered throughout the swamp, waiting for weather that would either wash away evidence or deliver it directly to their feet. The sheriff understood storm dynamics, knew that rising water would lift objects from the bottom and carry them along channels that led eventually to civilization. But he also knew that 6 days of swamp chemistry could transform a recognizable corpse into something that told stories through bone structure and dental work rather than familiar features. The rain hammered cypress roots and palmetto fronds with percussion that drowned out all other sound, turning the swamp into an orchestra of water, striking wood, leaf, and stone. Somewhere in that chaos, currents were shifting burial sites, redistributing secrets according to physics rather than human preference, preparing to deliver answers that no one had courage to receive. Blood calls to blood. At 7:30 that evening, as the storm reached its peak intensity, something large struck the fishing dock behind Morrison's command post with a sound like wet meat hitting wood. Deputy Harrison investigated with lantern held high, expecting storm debris or a fallen tree branch, but found instead what remained of Edmund Fairfield after 6 days of swamp justice and snake venom. The body floated face down, bloated with gas and water, clothing torn by current and claw until only fragments remained to suggest the fine fabric that had marked plantation aristocracy. But the corpse told its story through evidence that transcended decomposition, puncture wounds that spoke of fangs, rope burns around wrists and ankles that suggested restraint, and most damning of all, burlap fibers embedded in fingernails that had clawed desperately at fabric prison walls. Harrison vomited into water already fouled with death, his lantern casting dancing shadows that made the corpse seem to move with residual life. "Sheriff," he called through rain that muffled sound like cotton stuffed in ears. "Found him. Dear God in heaven, found what's left of him." Morrison waded into water that reached his chest, fighting current that wanted to reclaim its prize, and hauled Edmund Fairfield's remains onto the dock, where lamplight could reveal the full scope of what had been done to one of Florida Territory's most prominent citizens. The sheriff had seen death in many forms: yellow fever, dueling, slave uprisings, but nothing had prepared him for evidence of execution, carried out with such methodical precision. The story written on Fairfield's corpse would transform a missing person case into the largest manhunt in Territorial history, but it would also raise questions about justice that no court was prepared to answer. Multiple snake bites clustered around the neck and torso, suggested that Edmund Fairfield had died slowly, paralyzed by venom, while conscious enough to understand his fate, trapped in darkness, with creatures whose only language was strike and retreat. Death had come through suffocation and terror rather than blood loss. A prolonged execution that gave the victim time to contemplate every enslaved person he'd bought, sold, or separated from their families. But identifying the killer would require evidence that transcended circumstance and entered the realm of proof strong enough to hang a man in territorial court. What physical evidence could connect Tobias to this methodical execution? And would the enslaved community's wall of silence finally crack under pressure that no amount of unity could withstand? Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at the fishing dock carrying his medical bag and 20 years of experience examining bodies that told stories their killers never intended to reveal. Rain still drummed against cypress branches overhead, while lantern light cast dancing shadows across Edmund Fairfield's corpse, illuminating evidence that would either hang an enslaved man or expose the limitations of territorial justice. The territorial physician understood that in 1809 Florida, proving a slave had murdered his master required physical evidence strong enough to satisfy white jurors whose economic survival depended on maintaining the fiction that enslaved people were property rather than human beings capable of. Calculated revenge. Webb's examination began with the obvious. Multiple puncture wounds, consistent with venomous snake bites, concentrated around the neck and torso, where major blood vessels carried poison directly to the heart. But the pattern suggested something beyond random attack. The bites clustered in areas that would have been accessible through torn fabric, indicating that the snakes had struck through openings in whatever container had held victim and predators together. "Fetch me more light," Webb ordered Deputy Harrison, whose face had turned the color of old parchment. "And something to take notes. This examination needs documentation that will stand up in territorial court." The rope burns around Fairfield's wrists and ankles told their own story of restraint applied with nautical precision. The knots had been tied by someone who understood load distribution and pressure points, who knew how to secure struggling prey without cutting off circulation completely. Webb had seen similar rope work on fishing boats and merchant vessels, but never on a plantation where enslaved people were forbidden from learning skills that might facilitate escape. From Dr. Webb's official autopsy report, deceased shows evidence of prolonged restraint and systematic envenomation. Rope burns suggest maritime knowledge. Burlap fibers beneath fingernails indicate desperate struggle within confined space. But the most damning evidence lay embedded in Fairfield's clothing and skin, fragments of sailmaker's thread that matched nothing found during the previous searches of slave quarters. This thread was heavier than domestic cotton, waxed for water resistance, and stitched with patterns that spoke of professional seamanship rather than plantation needlework. Whoever had sewn Edmund Fairfield into his burlap prison possessed skills acquired through years of boat building and net repair. Webb extracted the threads with surgical precision, noting their color and thickness, while Morrison watched with growing understanding. The sheriff had questioned Tobias multiple times without discovering the man's maritime background, but rope burns and sailmaker's thread were painting a picture that circumstantial evidence couldn't erase. Someone on Fairfield Plantation possessed the knowledge and equipment necessary to transform ancient Roman execution into modern American justice. The examination revealed one final detail that would seal Tobias's fate: a distinctive scar on Fairfield's left forearm, where fabric had been torn during the struggle, exposing flesh to snake fangs that left bite marks deep enough to preserve dental impressions. But more importantly, the tear pattern in the burlap matched the thread samples, confirming that the same hands had sewn the prison and sealed the victim inside it. Justice has its own mathematics. Morrison assembled his men in the pre-dawn darkness, understanding that arrest needed to happen before the enslaved community could organize resistance or help their executioner escape into swampland that had swallowed countless fugitives. Tobias would be taken from his cabin while the plantation slept, removed before his fellow slaves could mount the kind of coordinated defense that had protected him through 6 days of investigation. The sheriff approached the quarters with the caution of someone who understood that enslaved people's apparent powerlessness could transform into deadly force under the right circumstances. 43 men and women had maintained perfect silence about Fairfield's disappearance, suggesting a level of organization that transcended individual loyalty and entered the realm of conspiracy. Arresting their executioner might trigger the kind of uprising that had haunted white nightmares since the Haitian Revolution. But evidence spoke louder than fear, and Dr. Webb's findings provided the legal foundation necessary to remove Tobias from the plantation and deliver him to Territorial justice. The sailmaker's thread had sealed his fate as surely as it had sealed Edmund Fairfield's burlap tomb. The cabin door opened before Morrison could knock, revealing Tobias fully dressed despite the hour, his possessions bundled as if he'd been expecting this moment. No surprise registered on his face when the sheriff announced the charges: murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit violence against a white person, destruction of property valued at more than $100. He submitted to shackles with the same mechanical compliance that had marked him since his family's sale. "Any last words for your people?" Morrison asked, gesturing toward cabins where candlelight flickered behind windows as the enslaved community woke to witness their protector's removal. Tobias spoke for the second time since learning of his wife and son's sale 3 years earlier, his voice carrying across the quarters like a prayer delivered to congregations who understood the price of resistance. "Freedom ain't free, and some debts can only be paid in blood." The words hung in humid air like smoke from a funeral pyre, promising that Edmund Fairfield's execution was beginning rather than ending something that would echo through Florida territory long after territorial courts had rendered their verdict. But would Tobias live long enough to face trial, or would frontier justice claim him before legal proceedings could reveal the full scope of his maritime knowledge and methodical planning? The Fernandina jailhouse squatted like a tombstone against the Florida coastline, its brick walls sweating condensation and humidity that turned iron bars slick as blood, while Spanish moss draped the building like funeral garlands. Inside the cramped cell that reeked of human waste and desperation, Tobias sat with the patience of someone who'd spent 3 years calculating the precise mathematics of revenge and understood that justice operated according to schedules beyond individual control. The trial, scheduled for September 15th, would determine whether territorial law could punish an enslaved man for executing his master, or whether frontier justice would claim him before legal proceedings could reveal the full scope of his maritime knowledge and methodical planning. Judge Cornelius Whitmore arrived from Tallahassee, carrying precedents from similar cases where enslaved people had killed their owners. Understanding that Tobias's conviction was legally certain but socially necessary to maintain the fiction that human property remained property regardless of provocation, the territorial court needed to demonstrate that rebellion carried consequences severe enough to discourage similar acts of revenge, while carefully avoiding any examination of the system that had created the conditions for such calculated violence. But the enslaved community at Fairfield Plantation had other plans for their executioner's fate. The jailbreak came at 2:30 in the morning on September 7th, executed with the same nautical precision that had characterized Edmund Fairfield's execution. 6 men approached the building from different directions, their movements coordinated through signals that had been perfected during years of resistance activities, helping runaways reach freedom, hiding stolen tools, maintaining the kind of underground networks that enabled survival under conditions designed to crush human spirit. From Sheriff Morrison's incident report, lock-picked with professional skill, no violence against guards, prisoner removed without disturbance to other inmates, suggests extensive planning and maritime knowledge among the conspirators. The rescue team included Samuel the blacksmith, whose wife had been sold to pay Fairfield's gambling debts, and Isaac the boat builder, whose knowledge of coastal waters matched Tobias's understanding of knots and sail work. They moved through Fernandina's sleeping streets, like shadows cast by memories, carrying their friend toward a fishing boat that waited in waters where Spanish rule had given way to American expansion, but freedom remained as wild and untamed as the territories themselves. Tobias spoke his final words to Florida Territory from the stern of that fishing boat, watching the coastline disappear into morning mist. Tell them we remember everything. Tell them we forget nothing. Tell them freedom ain't given, it's taken. The boat disappeared into coastal waters that led toward territories where Spanish law still governed, where enslaved people could purchase their freedom or simply disappear into populations that understood survival required invisibility. Behind them, alarm bells rang across Fernandina as Sheriff Morrison discovered an empty cell and evidence of coordination that transcended individual rebellion and entered the realm of systematic resistance. The manhunt that followed would span 3 states and cost the territorial government more than Edmund Fairfield's original purchase price. But the Okefenokee had taught its lessons well. Swamps that could swallow a master could equally hide his executioner, and waters that had delivered justice could provide sanctuary for those who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood and burlap, and the patient application of maritime knowledge to the ancient art of revenge. Power learned its own lessons. News of Tobias's escape spread through enslaved communities like wildfire across drought-stricken fields, carrying the message that masters were mortal, that justice could be sewn with sailmaker's thread, that the powerless possessed power if they understood how to apply knowledge acquired through years of watching, learning, and waiting for the perfect moment to transform bondage into weapon. The empty sack that had surfaced, torn and bloody, became legend. Its story whispered in quarters from Georgia to Louisiana, teaching lessons about patience, planning, and the mathematics of revenge that no amount of white violence could erase from collective memory. Edmund Fairfield's execution had planted seeds in soil fertilized by generations of separation, sale, and systematic dehumanization. Some say Tobias reached Haiti, where former slaves governed territories that had thrown off European rule through violence, systematic enough to terrify plantation owners across the American South. Others claim he disappeared into the Seminole territories of Florida, where runaway slaves found sanctuary among indigenous people who understood that survival required resistance to European concepts of property and law. But fishermen still report finding torn burlap sacks floating in coastal waters during storm season, empty except for bloodstains and the lingering scent of justice delivered through patience, nautical knowledge, and the kind of rage that ferments in bondage until it becomes something powerful enough to drag masters into darkness where all men are equal. Even today, descendants of enslaved people whisper about the power that lives in knowing how to tie knots, sew seams, and wait for the perfect moment when predator becomes prey in spaces too small for mercy or escape. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.